Sri Aurobindo Savitri starts with dawn. It was the hour before the gods awake. And it ends with the hope of a dawn and nursed in her bosom a greater dawn. It starts with the dawn of the day on which Satyavan was to die. And what happens in the interval between these two dawns is that in the morning, Satyavan and Savitri leave for the forest, and around noon, Satyavan dies, and then begins the encounter that Savitri has with the god of death. And that, in fact, occupies much of the interval, and in the book, it continues from book 8 onwards, and occupies around 4,000 lines. Now, this is something really momentous, because overnight there is something completely unimaginable, something unprecedented, and something which appears totally unreasonable to the reasoning mind happens. And what we see, in fact, is a clash between two forces of God, the god of death and Savitri. Both are forces of God. One has been appointed to cut short man's stay on earth, and another to perpetuate man's stay on earth, to make man immortal. And both have a necessity. Man comes to this earth with a purpose, and at the same time is born in ignorance, and therefore he does not often realize the purpose of his existence here, and it is only through some chance, through some accident, and through the stimuli provided by pain and suffering, that he manages to make a bit of progress during his stay. And if there were no fear of death, probably even that little bit of progress would not take place. And therefore God has appointed a force in the form of this god of death, who makes sure that at least man makes some progress and his stay does not continue indefinitely. And therefore we find that god of death takes pity on human beings who by and large seem to have wasted their life by not making full use of their stay here, and he is left with no choice but to disembody them, take their soul back to the other worlds, and then these souls have to wait to get embodied once again to make a little further progress if they decide to come back to the earth. On the other hand, Savitri visualizes a world where man will have a level of consciousness much higher than the present, a consciousness that goes beyond the mental, and therefore his outer life will be illuminated by the soul, by the pure light of the soul, by that light coming from that pure consciousness which he manifests, and therefore at that level of consciousness death will no longer be a necessity. So accordingly we find that in this debate that takes place between the two, which occupies much of this interval between these two dawns, we find that the god of death is realistically pessimistic, whereas Savitri is delightfully optimistic. Both have a point to make, and while to the reasoning mind what the god of death speaks appears very reasonable, but then reason cannot really lead to much progress in any sphere. At the most it can lead to small steps which go a little bit beyond where we already are in a very systematic step-by-step fashion. Giant leaps and breakthroughs come from going beyond reason and giving way to imagination and developing the confidence that if we can imagine it, it can happen. And that is why I think George Bernard Shaw said that all progress in the world in fact depends upon the unreasonable man. So we find that here again we have that sort of a clash. One force of God, the god of death, interested in maintaining the status quo, because he feels that that is what this earth is like and is always destined to be. Human beings will never be able to make full use of their stay here, and they are destined to live a life of ignorance, and pain, evil, and suffering are a necessity here, and so is death, so that they have this fear of so that they have the fear of death, and at least they make some use of their stay here. And therefore, he is convinced that that is how this world will always be, and any efforts to try and change it are doomed to failure, and he encourages Savitri not to mess with the established order. On the other hand, Savitri has been sent by the divine itself, so she is also a force of the divine, and she has been sent in response to the prayers of Ashwapati, who pleaded with the Divine Mother for a radical change in the life on earth, for a radical shift in the level of consciousness of this planet, so that evil, suffering, and misery will be wiped out forever, and death will no longer be a necessity. So, being a force of God, Savitri has a mission to accomplish and a plan, and she not only has the intention to accomplish her mission, she also has the will and the power necessary, and therefore she is very confident that she will be able to do what she is here for. And the forces, these two forces, therefore come into a clash, and ultimately we find that Savitri emerges victorious, and the god of death has to flee. Now, this is the spectacular progress that takes place between these two dawns. Now, Sri Aurobindo has chosen dawn and night as symbols, which are very appropriate in this situation, because night signifies darkness, ignorance, and when it is night, it seems as if it is going to be eternal, but it is not. And as the dawn approaches, we find that this cloak of darkness, as Sri Aurobindo calls it, starts falling. There is a breach, and the horizon lights up, and we find that there is a hope that we will have day. So, while night appears to be permanent, it is only a temporary darkness, and this is a symbol to Sri Aurobindo of the temporary ignorance in which man lives, because man's ignorance is a sort of a darkness of the human mind which refuses to get enlightened by the soul, and this darkness of the mind is also as temporary as the night, because if we look at the course of evolution, the creatures on this planet have been manifesting more and more of the divine consciousness, and if this trend continues, and there is no reason to believe that it will not continue, we should expect that the creatures to come after man will manifest this divinity, this supreme consciousness to a still greater extent. And when they do that, the surface instruments like the mind will no longer be dark, they will be well illuminated by this supreme consciousness, and therefore will act in its light. And when they do that, then naturally the way we look at the individual now will undergo a radical shift. Instead of looking at the world from the standpoint of division and multiplicity and separation, which gives rise to the ego, and which in fact is at the root of all human misery and suffering, instead of that, this enlightened mind, which Sri Aurobindo calls the supermind, will be able to look at the manifestation from the standpoint of oneness, and from that angle, from that plane, the whole perspective changes, and man will live a life which will be very different and will not require the stimuli, the goading, and that type of a hammer, as he calls it, which pain and suffering provide to wake up the sleeping soul and let that spark of the divine enter the human mind, that type of stimuli will no longer be necessary. On the other hand, dawn, with which the epic begins and ends, signifies the victory of light over darkness, the victory of knowledge over ignorance, and shows that no matter how invincible night appears, how invincible ignorance appears, it is not reasonable to give up hope, and we can always expect for yet one more dawn at the end of this darkness. So night and dawn, in fact, signify two different opposite types of phenomena. Night signifies something which is dark, ignorant, and static, whereas dawn signifies hope, illumination, knowledge, and progress, because dawn is not static, it progresses from dawn to morning and from morning to noon and so on. So we expect more and more light through the day, and this is how dawn brings that hope that yes, night was not going to last forever, and it is because of this recurrent cycle of day and night that even during the night we are sure that this will not going to last forever and we shall have the sunlight the next day, and true enough, at dawn our hopes are realized and we find that night is coming to an end. So these symbols are very appropriate for the vision that Sri Aurobindo has, which he has brought out through Savitri. So the two dawns, the dawn with which Savitri begins and the dawn with which it ends, are not two ordinary dawns. The first one brings hope, and the second one brings the realization of that hope, a certitude that things will change, and the destiny of man, the destiny of this planet is not doomed to be as the reasonable mind might suppose, and that there is a plan, there is a higher force that will ensure that this change does come about. The descent of the divine, which Savitri represents, will make sure that the things turn around. And therefore, while reading Savitri, the reader also is sure to undergo some type of a change. The very fact that someone starts reading Savitri is itself an expression of divine grace. That is how he somehow comes in contact with this epic and picks up the courage to start reading it. So takes that initiative. So in that sense, the very beginning of Savitri, to start reading Savitri itself is a very auspicious moment in the life of a person. And as he goes through these 24,000 lines of mystic poetry and moves from the dawn that signifies hope to the dawn that signifies the realization of that hope and a certitude, he cannot but be moved, touched, and uplifted. And therefore, his outlook is now different. He starts sharing with the epic the hope that things will change, and while it may appear unreasonable looking at the world around, he knows that God is great and wonderful are his ways, and things which appear very difficult to us can be very easy for the divine. Things which appear unimaginable can in fact come true, and just because something is very difficult does not mean that it will necessarily take very long, because the divine has its ways of accomplishing things at remarkable speed in a miraculous manner when things have to happen. And that is the type of certitude which Savitri generates, the type of optimism, and that is the significance of moving from dawn to a greater dawn that Savitri has been able to ensure. So while reading Savitri, the reader also moves from hope and joy towards the certitude that what he experiences while reading Savitri is something that is not going to be confined to just a few individuals, but is going to envelop the planet in the very near future.